provider page will let the customers to view and manage their service provider access on. And we will have a consistent resource manager template option because we can use an ARM template or an Azure Resource Manager template, which is represented by a JSON configuration file, to onboard delegated customer resources and perform some cross-tenant management tasks. And we can have a managed service offer in the Azure Marketplace. We can offer our services to customers through private or public offers on it and automatically onboard them to the Azure Lighthouse as needed. Okay, before going to lesson number 3, to query logs in the Azure Sentinel, let's go for the first guided demonstration, guys, for creating a workspace for the first time, let's say. A workspace built for the Microsoft Sentinel, basically. So we can go here for the default home section on it, and we can search or locate the Microsoft Sentinel service. I can see it here into my recent services used from other sessions with the same topic, for example, that I'm running. I already have a couple of examples, but I wanted to show you that if you are creating a Microsoft Sentinel and a workspace from zero, from nothing on it, you don't have nothing, and you're considering creating these two resources, for example, for creating your new Microsoft Sentinel. So you can start typing for searching for Sentinel service. You will display from the list of services, the result of your search, the Microsoft Sentinel resource. You can click on it, and you will see a list of existing Sentinels if you have more than one, or if you have one on list, for example. In my case, I don't want it to create it here, but let's say that I'm creating it with a new Sentinel service because of the region-specific log collection on it. So I can just click on Create, and I can see, okay, you have this available workspace that is not yet connected to another Sentinel or Security Center service, so you can use it if you want it. But well, this location is not the one that I'm looking for compliance, let's say. So I can click on Create a new workspace. And then I will be redirected from the user interface for the assistant or wizard for creating the log analytic workspace on it. So we will need as a prerequisite to create and define the workspace first that we are going to use for the log collection resource, basically. So here we can specify a couple of parameters. The required are defined by the red asterisk next to the name of the parameter. I need to select an active subscription, for example. I need to select a resource group, or I can create a new resource group logical container. For example, this could be the day 3 study group sessions, for example, or day 3 SG sessions. I can click on next, and then I will associate a name for this workspace. This could be the day 3 LAW for log analytic workspace, let's say for Sentinel. Then one of the other critical things to select is the choosing the Azure region that is right for us and our customers on it. It's a required parameter also. So let's say the West US 2 location is okay for me. So I can click on Review plus Create. A final validation will run and check my parameters. If I'm not skipping something or missing something or misconfiguring something. The pricing tier model is only one, pay as you go, paying per gigabyte, for example. We can see a legend that the cost of our workspace will depend on the volume of data ingested and for how long is retained. And then, well, there could be a difference between hosting the workspace into one region than another. We can use, for example, a tool like Pricing Calculator to find out, locate a workspace and look at an estimated cost based on the expected data to be stored and managed, basically single or multi-regions on it, and we can select or modify the region parameter to find out which are the cheapest regions, for example, for selecting the workspace. There could be cents of the dollars of difference on it, but at the large scale, when we have large amount of volumes and a lot of workspace resources, one by one, with a small saving, for example, for our region, if the regions is not a compliance issue, for example, into our uh, configuration. Basically, at the end, we can just click on create when everything is set and there is no failures on it. This is going to take like a minute to create the workspace on it. Pay attention to the notification area on the upper right corner on it. When you can see a green check, that means that your workspace was successfully created. Now you should be able to see it in your list by up to clicking on refresh after you receive the confirmation. You just highlight it, for example, on it. I can see it from here. I can highlight it, clicking on add, and now I'm returning to the wizard for creating my Microsoft Sentinel service on. And now I have another operation now building the Microsoft Sentinel resource and using that workspace link for the entire life cycle of the two resources, basically. Or until I just decide to not using anymore this workspace and connecting to another, for example, or deleting both resources. Here, for example, like we previously described, the most important thing for finding a use for the Microsoft Sentinel is and finding an incident or starting creating automatically incidents and alerts and automatic response and so on before all that automated configuration and going hunting and so on. The most critical thing here is for starting connecting the data sources. So we need to go and locate the data connectors options on it. Or we can here be located into the news and guides and the get started tab to follow these steps on it. Because you can start with collecting data at the cloud scale across the enterprise, both on premise and in multiple clouds. And step 2, once that you have data collected or ingested, then you can start thinking on creating some security alerts for focusing on what's important using analytics to create alerts on it. And then when there is alert generated, then you can think of an automate and orchestrate responses on it. You can use or customize built-in playbooks to automate common tasks, for example. So we can click here on the options to connect to be redirected to the data connector section on it. From the list, we will find out only built-in connectors list, 120, for example, from third-party, Microsoft, non-Microsoft, cloud services, and so on. So we can see it from the list. If I'm looking for something specific, I can use the main search box on the top and starting typing for looking and filtering across the hundreds of connectors on it by looking at the corresponding one that I wanted to start connecting to this workspace, basically. So I can start by scrolling down, and because the connectors are displayed by alphabetic order, I would expect to see on the first connectors on it, the ones that start with the Azure name on it. The most pretty straightforward to start connecting some data or logs would be performing an Azure to Azure data collection or log ingestion, for example. So if I'm looking through the Azure connectors, I can find out that there is Azure Active Directory built-in connector that I can connect. Well, I can just click to highlight the connector to read its description, and I don't need to guess what is the type of data collected with this by selecting this connector. Basically, by reading the description, I can find out all of the information associated with what is the type of data that you will expect to collect. But if you connect successfully this connector with this particular name, I can see the status. Not connected says. This little vertical rectangle with a gray color is actually representing a status. The gray color is representing a not connected yet. And the green color for that, it will be representing a status of connected. Right now, I just created a minute ago. So by default, there is no source of the data connected on. So I will not expect to see no green status display, for example, on it. So description for this Azure Active Directory connector built in. We can gain insights into Azure Active Directory by connecting audit and signing logs to Microsoft Sentinel to gather insights around the Azure Active Directory scenarios. We can learn about application usage, conditional access policies, legacy authentication related details using our sign-in logs, and we can get information of our self-service password reset or SSPR usage on Azure Active Directory management activities like user, group, role, application management using or audit logs table on. If we have the status of connected, we can see the last data received. The related content section is this connector has templates associated because related content is 8 built-in template workbooks that we understand from the description from the previous 2 lessons that a workbook is like a visualization dashboard on. These visualization dashboards will be created with results of logs. Remember that if we are accessing to the workspace, we have access to the querying editor option when we can start writing or using from the templates the built-in KQL queries. And by running those KQL queries, we will display an output into a table format, into a chart format, into a var, into columns, and so on. So basically, we can pull all those outputs for multiple KQL queries that we can just customize or that we can use as templates from a built-in query list. And we can centralize all those results for one or multiple data sources into one dashboard that is representing my workbook, for example. So there will be 8 templates associated with this data source that I can use and that I can download, let's say, and save it and use it as my private workbook on. I can reconfigure from the template or I can just use it out of the box with the default design on. But I only will expect to see data if I have the data ingested already or the connector connected actually on. So there is another template, 2 templates for built-in KQL queries for detecting some suspicious events that I can use it, download it, make it my private KQL, and I can run it on a frequency if I want it to continue in the future. And there is 59 associated with these data sources from this connector, 59 analytic rule templates. Like with the template for workbooks and for KQL queries, a rule template will be existing pre-configured rules that I can use as template to modify some settings or some parameters. And also I have the possibility of using out of the box, for example, and configuring the matching conditions on it or configuring the type of actions that we would like for the remediation or responding. And well, we can just decide to use it and importing this template, for example, for using it. Because the Azure Active Directory connector is considering the entire directory as a service and its related features on it, there is a lot of data types that we can collect from there. Remember that the login workspace is using an schema and multiple tables that is going to start collecting depending on the data sources on. So here, these data types are representing information across multiple tables on it, like signing logs, audit logs, service principal logs, managed identity logs, provisioning logs, risk event logs, risky user logs, and some others maybe on. So, okay, if I'm interested in connecting this data source on it to my Sentinel service, I can click on Open the Connector page at the bottom to start in looking, for example, to some prerequisites. Into these prerequisites, I will say, okay, you need to complete these 3 prerequisites for connecting or for configuring successfully this connection of this Azure Active Directory. You need a workspace with read and write permissions required. So the green check is detecting that I do have the permissions on. I need also diagnostic settings required to read and write permissions to Azure Active Directory diagnostic settings holes. And I need some tenant permissions that I require global admin or security admin on the workspace tenant on, which is not my role right now into this account or into this directory. So I'm not in compliance with these diagnostic settings or tenant permissions on it. I have different possibilities. In order to move on to the configuration and see the options, not just grayed out like in this case, but as available for me to just select it with the green checks and clicking on connect and just waiting for the process to finish, that I will need to be in compliance with the prerequisite with the triggering checks first on. So I have two possibilities right now. If I understand that I don't have the permissions for the diagnostic and tenant permissions on it, what I can do is to check if PIM is being used and if I'm eligible for elevating my role and making a request right now. I will need this global or security admin role just to be in compliance with the prerequisite. So I can elevate my role with the PIM, Privileged Identity Management, if some other administrator assign me as eligible for that temporary role, let's say. That could be one option. After I'm receiving the role, I can return to the Sentinel and I will see at a new status for the prerequisite that should be completed. And now I can use the checkbox for starting selecting one or a couple of all of the data types to collect and then completing the process, basically. If that is not an option, if the organization is not using PIM or is not under my knowledge, the other option would be that, okay, somebody to assign me a role with a manual operation, for example, on it, or somebody that has the permissions to perform and completing these steps for configuring the log collection. If my permissions are limited to, for example, becoming a Sentinel reader, I don't have permissions to connect the sources, but once that I receive a notification that a user with permissions just connect the data source, then I can access the Sentinel with the read-only permissions, and I can start looking at the results for that, like a running queries where we read only permission, looking at incidents trigger, receiving notifications on it, and so on, and looking at the Sentinel configurations, but not making any changes, for example, for security reasons. And well, this is just specifically for one connected source. Every connector will have its own custom description, its own related content with templates or not available. Some connectors will not come with no workbook template, with no query, with no rule analytic template. But that doesn't mean that we cannot create our own workbook, for example, our own queries for that data source, for our own rule analytic template, for example, from that data sources also. We have the possibility for doing that, because if we return to the Sentinel menu, we can see under the threat management, for example, a workbook section. And here I can see, okay, there is workbooks from templates from a built-in 113, for example. You don't have any saved workbook yet, but you can click on the option for starting adding yours and starting with an empty space, for example. Into this workbook, you're accessing to a canvas, for example, that you can start specifying different sections for creating your custom workbook visualization dashboard. I can click on editing, for example, reconfigure this new workbook for a different name, or I can click on edit here for reconfiguring the text from new workbook, for example, for the, I don't know, the day 3 for a study group SC200 sessions. And then, okay, when I'm done with this option, that I can click on done editing, or if I would like to include into this section, adding a query result, adding a metric, adding a group, adding more text, adding parameters or link and tabs, for example. Clicking on the option to add in a query, I can see a portion of the login workspace query that I should start writing, or that I just copy and paste and run the query, for example. Into this option, I can configure the format of the output, and I can display the output into this section of this workbook, basically. When I'm done with this, and I can also use some breaks for sections, and into the breaks for section, I can start adding, for example, another text option that I can start using the same operations here for adding new text for a new section and so on. When I'm done editing, I can click on done, or I can click on save to give a name to my private workbook, for example. And I can see the change from my empty new workbook with basically the header on it. Day 3 for SG, for a study group, for SC200 sessions, for example. And then I can share it with the other members of the organization, make it available for those, and everybody can see the workbook and see the results. Now, what I'm doing here is using into this workbook, displaying the results of the queries but into a central place instead of going for the query editor and running query 1 and look at the result, running query 2 and look at the result, query 3, 4, 5, and so on, but switching through the different visualization options, I can concentrate all those outputs into different rendering formats into one workbook only. And all the time that I'm looking at the result or at the graph or at the bar or at the output on it, I will see an option to automatically refresh the content and looking for the most recent information when I need it, for example. So we can create from templates, or we can create from an empty, from nothing, from zero, for example. We can find out alongside with the workbooks on it, the analytic rules, for example. There's a list of templates, 41 active rules, for example, that we can use, but we have a possibility to create more. And a scheduled query rule, a Microsoft incident creation rule, or an NRT query rule, for example, that we can create from here. We can modify the status, enabling or disabling. All these rule templates are enabled by default. I can take a deeper look at the description for this rule purpose, for example, and I can decide to delete it, to disable it, or to disable or enable it after we just decided to disable it. And we have an option to create my 42, 43, 44, or importing from the connectors template by adding another 50 for the Azure AD, for example, and I have a total of 91. And all those rules, I'm monitoring certain conditions on it. So from the 100 rules, for example, that I have, if one or more than one are detecting something suspicious and I consider there to notify or to automate reaction on it, then I will expect to see notifications when there is an incident created based on those rules. All right, so that was the process for creating the Sentinel service and the process for starting connecting the data sources on it. From a different account that I should have permissions, but my subscription is expired, I can show you also a connected source and already couple of connected sources on that I believe that is into this Sentinel should be reporting already. Well, no information here. Let me search for, because I have two of them. The Sentinel December 21, no information. And the other is SC200 Sentinel 1. No information from here also, okay. All right, well, I don't have, well, maybe I'm not displaying the logs anymore because I don't have the subscription active on it. Let me see if I can see a reported data connector from here, but it will not, no, there is no information reported from these two Sentinel like data connected. Yeah, 9 connected data sources from this Sentinel service on. By scrolling down, I can see the status option with the green rectangles or vertical rectangles, for example, that I have into this Sentinel, the Azure Active Directory already connected, the Active Directory Identity Protection also, and the Defender products, I think. I can keep scrolling down for looking at, you have the Microsoft 365 Defender, the Insider Risk Management, no, Insider Risk Management is not connected. The Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Endpoint, for Identity also, and for Office 365. I have the Office 365 that is more like for the client-side version, not the security. And that's also the Windows security events by AMA, for example. Workspace from Facebook, Zoom reports, Zscaler, and so on that we can integrate. When there is a third-party connector, like let's say a Sophos XG firewall, for example, the steps to follow are going to be completely different on it, because the prerequisite would be that we need to have that Sophos XG firewall virtual or physical appliance into our other environment or into our private cloud. And we need to, for example, into the configuration to perform all these steps. for a successful connection on it. For example, this data connector will depend on a parser based on a custom function to work as expected. You can click here to follow this step to create the custom functions alias Sophos XG firewall. And then step 1, install and onboard an agent for Linux. Syslogs are collected only from Linux agents. Choose where to install the agent, into an Azure Linux VM or into a non-Azure Linux VM. Configure the logs to be collected, select the link below, select Add Facility, mark the checkboxes, click on Apply, open your Workspace agent configuration, configure and connect the Sophos SG firewall, follow these instructions to enable the syslog streaming and completing all the steps. But that's why I just described to you that the most very straightforward option is to use an Azure to Azure data sources to connect to the workspace, because well, we just need permissions for that, and just clicking and save or open or starting connecting or just clicking on connect base. If we do have the permissions and the active subscription and resources are ready, the most very straightforward. For a third-party one like this, we just need to configure maybe more complex steps, but I can follow the guidance into these instructions and configurations. And once that we have the connected data source, then the next step will be, okay, starting integrated out some recommended workbook, query samples, templates, or relevant analytic rules, for example, associated with this data source.